The fire crackled, casting the slender shadow of a woman bathing behind a thin cloth screen. Caleb stood silent, his hand clenched white at the knuckles, his voice breaking rough like a confession. "Let me be near you. Just once." The figure behind the curtain gave a trembling nod, not fleeing. His breath caught. His hand shook as it touched the fabric's edge. One deep breath, then he slowly lifted it. Through the haze of steam stood Amara, her body quivering beneath the first gaze of a man who truly saw her. Caleb stepped close, his arms closing tight around her small frame from behind. And in that moment, after long years of being branded useless, Amara was finally seen, finally held whole, and called beautiful. The hammer struck down on dry wood, sharp and final as a sentence. That day, the square of Cedar Hills fell into a silence so heavy it chilled the bone, broken only by the whisper of wind through the flagpoles and the cutting murmurs of those gathered to watch. Her name rang out, harsh against the crowd. Amara Johnson. A black woman, 28, once the wife of a prosperous merchant in town, now called forth to receive her last humiliation. No decent reason was needed to drive her out. 10 years of marriage without a child, that was the only crime. But it was weight enough for her husband to stand before the whole town and declare, "This woman is a curse on my house. From this day on, she has no place in Cedar Hills." No one spoke for her, no one stepped in. All eyes turned her way, some gloating, some pitying, most steeped in the cruelest silence. Amara stood still, clutching the small cloth bag that held all she had left. 2 worn dresses, her mother's silver brush, and a frayed Bible. A life reduced to scraps. When the judge closed the ledger, his voice was cold, flat. 3 days. Leave town. Do not return. Whispers rippled through the crowd, sharp as needles. Amara's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, anything at all, but the words died in her chest. 3 days later, iron wheels ground over red dust as the wagon carried her away from Cedar Hills. The clatter of metal was so harsh it seemed to squeeze her heart with every turn. Across the bench, the driver, a gray-haired old man with a weathered face, glanced at her more than once. In his eyes lay the weary knowledge of one who had seen too many souls driven out, and a touch of pity he could not hide. "Long road ahead. Don't count on anyone waiting," he muttered, voice rough with gravel. Amara said nothing. She huddled into her thin coat, biting her lip until she tasted blood. Outside, gray clouds smothered the sky, swallowing the sun, as though heaven itself shared her grief. Once she had dreamed of a small family, a warm house filled with children's laughter. 10 years had cut those dreams into wounds. Bloodstains on white cloth, the wary eyes of doctors, the mocking smiles of young mothers at the market. All of it pressed down upon this day, branding her as unworthy. Her hands shook as she clutched the cloth bag to her chest, clinging to its faint warmth. Inside, her mother's silver brush was cold to the touch, pulling forth memories of another woman who had borne her own share of scorn. The horse shrieked, the wagon jolted, then stopped short. "End of the road," the old driver said, curt but not unkind. He pointed to the distance, a valley carpeted in green, and in its midst a log cabin with smoke rising thin into the gray sky. "Someone lives there. Caleb Whitmore. He takes in folk who've nowhere else to go. See if you can find work and hold on." Amara lifted her gaze. Far off, The cabin stood like a lonely outpost at the edge of the cone world. Each step toward it would be a step into exile, cut off from everything she had known. But behind her, the red dirt road was gone for good. The driver climbed down, careful as he set her bag upon the ground. For an instant, his hand brushed hers, warm, startling in its kindness. His eyes lingered longer than they should have. A faith. He wished to say more, but only sighed. Amara bowed her head in thanks. Though her voice was lost in the wind, the wagon rolled away, wheels fading into the timber line until silence swallowed all. Only the wind through the trees remained, and the wild beat of Amara's heart. She stood there, small and adrift in the wide grassland, her cloth bag pressed tight to her chest, as if holding the shattered weight of her life. One step, then another. Her feet sank into damp earth. Each move was heavy as stone, yet the cabin waited ahead. She knew if she stopped, there would be nowhere left to go. Amara followed the narrow track through the grass, her worn shoes dragging, the small cloth bag pulled tight against her shoulder. The weeds brushed her calves, heavy with evening dew that clung cold to the hem of her dress. Somewhere ahead, water whispered over stone, a patient heartbeat guiding her on, until the path opened to a narrow stream, clear and flashing with the last light of day. She knelt at the bank, cupped her hands, and lifted the water to her lips. The cold cut her throat sharp, reminding her she was still a levasum. But when she bent to drink again, she startled at the shadow reflected beside her own. Across the stream stood a tall man with a wooden pail, water dripping steady from the yoke across his shoulders. He set it down, straightened, and his deep brown eyes caught her startled gaze. He said nothing at first, only nodded. Slow, steady, enough for her to know she wasn't invisible. You live here?" Her voice trembled, nearly carried away by the wind. "Yes," he said, his tone low and rough. "Name's Caleb Whitmore. My cabin's up the ridge." He tilted his head toward the stand of pines where smoke curled faint into the sky. "You're the one dropped off by the wagon, aren't you?" Amara clutched the bag tighter. She didn't answer, but her lowered eyes told him all. Caleb asked no more. He lifted the bucket, stepped across the stones, and stopped before her. "If you've nowhere else to go, you can rest at my place." Such plain words struck her chest like a blow. For days she had heard nothing but dismissal. Now, for the first time, a man's offer carried no demand, no shame. The walk up was short but steep, the pines standing tall like silent guards. When they reached the ridge, Amara paused. The cabin rose solid before her, its walls planked straight, its roof snug, smoke curling with the scent of resin. A wooden chair sat on the porch, faded curtains hung in the window, traces of a woman's hand once present. Caleb set the bucket down on the step, then moved to the door. He opened it, but did not enter. Instead, he held the latch, his eyes brushing hers. "Go on," he said, stepping aside. She froze. She was used to walking behind, used to the sneer of a husband, the doors that shut against her. Yet here a stranger opened the way, bidding her pass first. Ordinary to anyone else, yet to Amara it cracked a wall built from years of humiliation. She stepped inside. The air smelled of pine and smoke. The cabin was clean, orderly. A few old books on the shelf, pots polished bright in the tidy kitchen, Chairs lined square at the long table. A man's hand lived here, but also remnants of a woman. The curtain, folded linens, dried flowers in a clay jar. Amara held her bag close. I only ask to stay a few days, until I can find somewhere else. Caleb didn't look long at her. He only nodded. That's fine. There's room for one more. That night, he cooked a simple stew of meat, potatoes, and carrots. Steam rose thick with pepper, stinging her throat until she coughed. Caleb flushed red, fumbling to pour her water. Sorry, I usually cook for one. Never measured much. Amara gave a small laugh, the sound surprising even her. How long had it been since she laughed at a supper table? Sitting before the fire's glow, she realized this was the first time a man had tended to her without contempt, without cost. After they ate, she faltered, unsure where she should sleep. Caleb cleared the dishes, then pointed to a small room off the hall. You take my bed. The blankets are clean. I'll sleep out here on the floor. No, I can't. Amara shook her head, startled. You can, Caleb cut in. Calm but firm. You need the rest. I'm used to the floor. Doesn't trouble me. The door swung open, warm light spilling out. On the bed lay folded sheets, a pillow set square, a kindness she had never thought to meet. Amara set her bag down slow, her eyes stinging. In all her life, no one had shown her such regard. That night, she lay on the clean bed, listening to Caleb's footsteps as he spread a blanket on the floor beyond the door. She turned her face to the wall. Tears came, but they were not only of shame. They carried with them a thread of relief, as if, at last, she had found a small roof to shelter beneath in the endless storm of her life. The next morning, Amara woke in the small room with sunlight streaming through faded curtains. For the first time in days, she had slept in a proper bed. No whispers of a crowd, no grind of wagon wheels in her ears. Only mountain birds calling to one another, and the faint smell of coffee drifting in from the kitchen. Caleb had risen early. He sat by the fire, a worn book in his hands. His eyes reading, but his ears tuned to every stir within the cabin. When Amara stepped out, her black hair tied hastily, her eyes still holding shyness, he only gave a nod. Coffee's hot. Breakfast was plain, dry bread and a touch of honey, but to Amara it tasted like a feast. A quiet gratitude rose in her chest, awkward yet real. It had been so long since a man sat across from her and waited for her to eat with him. That afternoon, after they had cleaned up together, Amara asked carefully, Here, is there a place to bathe? Her voice was small, hesitant, as if the thought itself were too much to hope for. Caleb looked up, his deep brown eyes showing a flicker of surprise. Then he nodded, setting down the axe he had been sharpening. There is. A stream behind the pines, cold and clean. I'll take you there at sundown. His answer was simple, yet her chest tightened. A stream. Alone. The thought made her both nervous and restless. When evening painted the ridges with copper-red light, Caleb led the way. He walked ahead, broad shoulders dark against the fading sky, an old yoke across his hands for carrying water. The path whispered with pine needles underfoot. Amara followed. Her heart quickened not from the climb, but from some vague anticipation waiting at the end of the trail. The stream opened before them, no wider than a man's reach, the water clear as glass, mirroring the purple sky. The air was damp, cool, laced with stone and moss. Caleb set the buckets down, pointed toward a flat rock jutting across the bank. "You can bathe here. I'll sit over there. No one will come near." He turned, sat with his back to the stone, eyes on the ridge. But in his chest, a heat stirred, heavy and unwelcome. He heard the rustle of fabric, then the soft slap of water as she stepped in. The stream's chill cut her skin, and Amara shivered. Yet soon the cold gave way to a strange calm as she bent down, letting the water wash away road dust and the shame of recent days. Her dark hair fanned out, drifting like silk along the current. Caleb shifted, his eyes straying against his will through the gap in the rock. The sight struck him deep, the curve of her back glistening under dim light, each drop rolling along her shoulders, her neck. He turned away quick, his hands gripping his knees tight. But his heartbeat pounded, ragged and unrelenting, as if he had walked a long, hard road in a single breath. Amara did not know of the eyes behind her, wrestling silently. She only felt the water's cold gentleness, her hands moving across her skin, scrubbing away years of filth and humiliation. For the first time in many years, her body did not feel like a curse. It felt alive, capable of feeling, capable of being her own. When she stepped from the stream, hair dripping heavy down her back, she found Caleb already on his feet, turned aside, holding out a worn cloth. His gaze avoided hers, but his hand was steady. "Thank you," Amara whispered, though her heart stirred, unsure if it was the cold or the strength of that offered hand. That night, the cabin lay wrapped in silence. Outside, wind tapped against the walls. Inside, the stove fire cast its orange glow. Amara lay beneath clean blankets, resin still faint in the cloth. Caleb, as promised, lay on the floor of the main room, his frame stretched beneath a rough quilt. But sleep eluded him. Again and again, her figure in the water came back, the shine of droplets on her skin, the strands of hair clinging wet to her neck. His chest burned, his heart hammering like it had not in years. He closed his eyes, willing the thought away, but the sound of her breath from the next room seemed to echo through the cabin. A man long tempered by silence and solitude now found himself undone by the nearness of a woman who had stepped into his life by chance. All through the night, he turned restlessly, the storm outside no match for the storm inside. Part of him feared what had been stirred awake, yet another part already knew. From the moment he saw her in that stream, he could never return to the loneliness he once called home. In the days that followed, Amara slowly learned to live by the breath of the mountains. Each morning, when sunlight spilled through the pines, she scattered grain for the hens clucking at her feet. The fat birds jostled one another for seed, sometimes lifting their heads to stare at her with foolish eyes, making her laugh softly. Her laughter carried across the quiet yard, a strange, bright music in a cabin that had known only the whisper of wind and the thud of an axe. In the kitchen, she tried her hand with flour, potatoes, salted meat. The first loaves came out with their edges singed, yet the smell of baking spread so richly that Caleb, working in the yard, stepped inside and stood still a moment before saying, "Been a long time since I smelled that." Amara flushed, feigned busyness, though warmth settled into her heart. When she found spare moments, she wandered along the stream, wading barefoot in the chill water. Wildflowers grew thick on the banks, purple, yellow, white, nodding in the breeze. When she lifted her face, the sky stretched deep and blue, laying across her life a peace she had never known. Yet even in such beauty, fear sometimes pressed upon her. If one day Caleb decided she was useless, would he cast her out as the town had done? At those thoughts, her chest tightened, her hand clutching her skirt's hem without knowing. But little by little, Caleb's small gestures drove the fear away. One morning, as she reached the porch, she found his thick coat already hanging there, as if to say, "The air is cold. Keep warm." She stood still a long while, her hand on the coarse fabric, her heart trembling. Some afternoons, Caleb swung his axe in the yard, each stroke steady and sure. Amara carried water out to him, the tin cup steaming in her hand. He looked up, sweat tracing down his temple, and took the cup from her. He drank deep, then gave a brief nod. Their eyes met, only for a heartbeat, but it was enough to send her turning away, cheeks hot. One day she brought him a plate of fresh bread, steam still curling from the crust. Caleb set his axe aside, wiped his hands roughly on his trousers, and sat on the porch step. He bit into the bread, chewed slow, then nodded. Amara sat beside him, unfolded a cloth, and lifted it gently to wipe the sweat from his neck. The moment the cloth touched his skin, Caleb froze. Warmth from her hand pressed through, and a shiver ran down his spine. A life lived in solitude had never prepared him for the quiet touch of a woman's hand. Amara startled too, pulling back quick. But Caleb surprised her, catching her hand in his large sun-browned palm closed around her slender fingers. He drew her closer, leaned low, and whispered, his voice rough with heat, "The bread's good." The space between them vanished, close enough that Amara felt his breath warm against her cheek. Her heart hammered so hard it seemed it might leap free. Her eyes darted away, her face flushed red like a wildflower under sun. Caleb let her hand slip from his, slow, careful. Yet the weight of that moment lingered, hanging in the air between them. A distance once kept had been broken, leaving a new rhythm echoing through the cabin, one that stirred both fear and a hunger neither dared name. The wind howled through the cabin's seams, hurling snow against its walls. Outside, the mountains lay buried in a white haze. Paths vanished as if they had never been. The storm came sudden, fierce and unrelenting, binding Amara and Caleb within the small house. Those days, life slowed to the pace of wind and snow. Amara sat by the window where pale light filtered through frost. She mended Caleb's shirt, its collar frayed, its sleeves torn. Each stitch small, steady, careful, as though she were piecing back not just cloth, but her own torn life. Caleb sat across from her, turning an unlit pipe in his hand, his eyes following the gentle rhythm of her needle. At night, they sat before the fire. The flames cast an amber glow over their faces. Caleb spoke of summers spent riding the plains, of winters where only the wind kept him company. His voice was low, words few, each one solid as an axe stroke sinking into wood. The sound lingered in Amara's chest. She listened, surprised yet comforted. This man, thought to be stone-hard and closed, carried a wide world within him, one as lonely as her own. On the third night of the storm, the water in the bucket froze solid. With no way to reach the stream, Amara had to heat water indoors. Caleb helped her pull an old cloth across one corner of the room, then quietly fed more logs to the fire, raising the flames higher. The cabin grew hushed, the only sound the crack and drip of water in the iron pot. Amara stepped behind the curtain, her heart pounding. Her hands shook as she shed smoke-damp clothes, her skin revealed in the rising steam. Caleb sat not far, his back against the wooden chair, yet his eyes strayed to the shadow cast upon the curtain. Firelight flickered, shaping Amara's form into flowing lines, the delicate slope of a bare shoulder, the slender curve of her back. The sight left his throat dry. He tried to look away, but the pull held him fast. His chest rose heavy, his breath thick. Years of solitude had taught him silence, restraint. But now the silhouette of this woman slipped past every wall he had built. Amara felt it too. She could not see him, but she knew Caleb's gaze pressed warm through the thin cloth. She bent forward, lifted water in her hands, let it fall along her shoulders. Yet her skin prickled not only from the chill, but from the knowledge that, for the first time in years, she was truly seen. Her body trembled with more than cold. Shame and longing twisted within her, fear and hunger in equal measure. Longing, because at last her flesh was not dismissed as barren. Fear, because if she let hope grow, it might turn once more to humiliation. The snowstorm showed no sign of easing. Outside, the wind wailed through the pines like voices of lost souls. Inside the cabin, firelight quivered warm against the log walls, casting long shadows of two lonely people divided only by a thin curtain. Caleb stood still behind it, his hand clenched white at the knuckles. From the moment Amara stepped behind that cloth, from the instant her soft figure traced across the fabric, he had not known peace. His heart pounded like a war drum, half urging him to flee into the safety of silence, half pushing him forward to face the hunger buried for too many years. He drew a deep breath, then spoke, his voice low, rough, yet earnest. Amara, if I said I wanted to be closer, would you allow me? On the other side, she froze. Her body trembled, not only from the chill of the water she had bathed in, but from those words. 10 years of being called useless, cast aside. Never once had she heard such a tender asking. Her chest tightened, her lips quivered, and at last she whispered two fragile words. Yes. That was enough to set Caleb's chest ablaze. Slowly he lifted the curtain. The cloth fell aside, and before him stood her slender frame, trembling yet unflinching. He stepped near, his arms closing around her from behind. Her body pressed to his, warm and soft, a gift he had thought forever lost to him. Her damp hair spilled across her shoulders, carrying the scent of water, smoke, and something wholly her own. He bent his head, buried his face in the hollow of her neck, drawing a long breath before murmuring, almost afraid to break the fragile moment. Let me kiss you. Amara shut her eyes, gave the faintest nod. Caleb turned her gently in his arms. In the flicker of amber light, every line of her came clear. The bronze of her skin, the shiver in her shoulders, the blue of her eyes, shy yet blazing with want. The words slipped from him raw and rough. Beautiful. Simple but truer than anything he had ever spoken. The words struck Amara like a bell. She had known only scornful stares, cruel jests. Now, in this man's eyes, she was beautiful. Tears brimmed, but her lips curved in a trembling smile. Caleb lowered his mouth to hers. Their first kiss was not hurried, not fierce but deep, like stitching torn places inside each other. His hand slid along the small of her back, holding her close, while Amara let out a soft cry, surrendering into his arms. That night, they gave themselves to one another, quietly, without haste. Only the storm beat its rhythm outside, while their hearts struck together within. Caleb was gentle, patient, filling each hollow long left empty. Amara opened, trembling yet trusting, like dry earth finally meeting rain. They wrapped around each other in warmth, in passion tempered by healing. As the fire sank to embers, Amara pressed her cheek to Caleb's chest, listening to the steady drum of his heart. Her voice broke in hushed wonder. "I've never been held like this, never been called beautiful." Caleb pulled her tighter, whispered into her hair, "You are everything, the one I choose." Outside, the storm still roared, but within the small cabin, for the first time, neither of them felt cold. They had found a warmth that did not come from fire, but from each other. Pale dawn crept through the curtain, laying soft golden streaks across the cabin's wooden wall. Amara stirred, the blanket slipping from her shoulder to reveal skin still marked by another's touch. For a fleeting instant, she thought she was dreaming of strong arms, of kisses both burning and tender, of a night where loneliness no longer ruled. But the bitter scent of coffee drifting through the room told her she was awake, waking to a morning unlike any before. She sat up, her heart racing faster than usual. On the small table beside the bed sat a tin cup, steam rising still. Beneath it lay a scrap of paper, the letters plain but steady, "Cold morning." "Drink to keep warm." Amara wrapped her hands around the cup, heat soaking into her palms as if the man's warmth still lingered there. A smile tugged at her lips, so rare that it startled even her. In the kitchen, Caleb fed wood to the fire. When Amara stepped out, her hair loose from sleep, he looked up. Their eyes met, then both turned away at once, awkwardness plain in every movement. No longer strangers, yet not easy enough to speak without care. "Coffee. Taste all right?" Caleb asked, his voice rough. "Yes, it's good," she answered, her cheeks burning. Between them hung a quiet chord, unspoken but felt. The night before had erased the distance. Both knew that they had stepped into something new, but neither dared give it a name. That day, the cabin breathed a softer air. Amara busied herself in the kitchen, baking a new batch of bread. Dough clung to her fingers as she worked, while her eyes kept stealing glances out the window, where Caleb split wood. Each stroke was steady, solid, like the heart of a man who hid his feelings but gave himself wholly to what he held. When the bread came from the oven, its sweet smell filled the room. Amara smiled faintly as she set the loaves to cool. She turned to the shelves, arranging them with feigned purpose, and in that moment caught sight of a large, sun-browned hand sneaking a loaf from the tray. She turned just as Caleb bit into it quick, like a man afraid of being caught. For once, his stern face showed a rare flicker of embarrassment. "I only meant to see if it burned," he muttered, scratching at his head. Amara laughed out loud, light as spring water. "You don't have to hide. I'll set aside a whole plate for you if you like." The wind still blew outside. Snow still fell, but warmth swelled inside the cabin. Caleb looked at her then, his eyes carrying something new, gratitude, and wonder at the life she had breathed into his long, silent home. That evening, they sat again by the fire. Amara stitched at his shirt, while Caleb shared bits of life in the mountains. The stories were short, the silences longer, but the silences no longer pressed heavy. In the glow, their eyes brushed against one another, darted away, then sought each other again, like a hidden dance. Amara set her needle down, her fingers touching lightly at her wrist, her chest stirring with a quiet fear. Would this be only a passing season? Would there come a day when he said he'd had enough and send her away, as her husband once had? The fear lingered, but with it glowed a faint spark. Hope. Caleb seemed to sense it. He leaned forward, set another log on the fire, then said quietly, without meeting her gaze, "Amara, so long as you wish it, this cabin will always have a place for you." Her breath caught, her heart stumbling. It was no vow, no proposal, but it was a promise all the same, enough to hold to. She nodded, whispered, "I wish it." The flames flickered, reflecting in both their eyes. No more words were needed. The quiet bond tightened between them. Outside, the storm still moaned, but within, laughter, a whispered promise, and the scent of fresh bread made the winter feel shorter. And that night, when Amara returned to bed, she clutched the blanket close, a smile lingering on her lips. Caleb, in the next room, looked at the tray of half-eaten loaves and felt a peace he had never known. Both understood. From this moment, neither feared the emptiness any longer. The snow thinned, uncovering the trail that wound down into the valley town. Caleb readied the wagon, while Amara stood on the porch, clutching her coat, her stomach tight with unease. It was the first time she had faced a town since Cedar Hills. They went for flour, salt, lamp oil. By day, the streets were not crowded, yet full enough for eyes to turn on them. The not yet married couple who did not fit. Caleb walked upright, his back straight, his gaze fixed ahead. Amara's fingers tightened around the wicker basket she carried. The whispers came, sharp as knives. "That's her, the woman who couldn't bear a child. And someone took her in anyway. Must be pity, nothing more." Each word cut her raw. Heat rushed to her face, her throat closed. Her hand trembled, nearly dropping the basket. Caleb noticed. He laid a steady hand on her shoulder, firm. He said nothing, but the weight of his presence carried her past the gauntlet of stairs. By late afternoon, they returned to the cabin, silence heavy around them. But before breath steadied, the sound of hooves came clattering up the yard. A silver-bearded man swung down, coat dusted with miles of road, grinning wide. "Caleb, you old hermit, it's been years." Landry Boone, a wanderer, a friend from long ago. He unpacked his sacks, spilling stories of the frontier as Caleb poured whiskey and Amara set bread fresh from her oven. Landry ate, drank, laughed, filling the room with noise. But as the liquor warmed him, he let slip. Heard Cedar Hills turned ugly. Hauled a barren woman into the square, shamed her before all. And that poor soul was... His words trailed off. His eyes flicked toward Amara. She froze, color draining. The memory struck like cold wind. The mocking laughter, the condemning stares, the sentence that drove her out. Caleb slammed his cup hard against the table, eyes darkening. "Enough, Landry." The room fell still. Landry swallowed, nodded, and held his tongue. But the wound had already opened in Amara's face. That night, while Landry slept heavy in the outer room, Amara sat alone by the fire. Her hands trembled as they twisted the edge of her shawl, her eyes on the flames, but seeing nothing. Caleb stepped in, saw her small figure bent in the red glow, and anger stirred hot in his chest. Not at her, but at the world that had broken her so deep. He sat beside her, his words plain. Only fools can't see you. She lifted her head, eyes brimming, as if she doubted her hearing. He went on, voice rough but sure. They see what you lack. I see what you carry. Strength, pride, a kind heart. They're blind, Amara. But I am not. Tears slipped free. For the first time, someone did not dodge her shame, but named it, then raised it up as no disgrace at all. Her voice cracked. I'm afraid. Afraid one day you'll look at me as they did. Caleb laid his broad, warm hand over hers, holding firm. No, I chose you. I will keep choosing you tomorrow, the day after. Not for what you bear or don't bear, for who you are. Her shoulders shook as she leaned against him. Outside, the wind still tore across the mountains, but inside the cabin a vow had been spoken, anchoring their small vessel against the storm. That night, the cabin lay still among the pines. The fire in the stove had burned low, leaving only embers glowing faintly, enough to cast light across the faces of two people sitting side by side. Amara clutched the shawl in her lap, then let out a breath she had held for 10 long years. Caleb. Her voice was so soft, she seemed afraid of hearing it herself. 10 years of marriage, and not one day was I called a wife in truth. He did not interrupt. His dark eyes stayed on the fire, giving her room to speak. They married me like a piece of property. They waited month by month, year by year, for my belly to swell, but each month ended in blood on my dress. Each time his eyes grew colder, more filled with contempt. 10 years I lived under a sentence. Useless. Her voice broke. Her eyes glistened. They did not want me as a woman. They wanted me as a womb. When I failed, I became the shame of the whole family. Every word was a stone thrown, every look a lash. In the end, they dragged me into the square at Cedar Hills and cast me out like a mangy dog. The whole town laughed. 10 years, all folded into one afternoon of disgrace. Tears dropped onto the back of her hand, but she did not hide them. For the first time, she let another see the wounds she carried. Caleb was silent a long while. Then he laid his broad, weathered hand over hers, warm, solid, as though he could give her his strength. Amara, his voice sank low. I know the feeling of being left behind. I've lost everything, too. She looked up, searching his face, and found in the hardened lines a fragile crack. My wife. She died 8 years ago. A fever, too quick to stop. I stood helpless as the only woman who ever spoke my name with gentleness slipped away, leaving this cabin hollow. Since then, I've lived with silence, with the sound of an axe, with the wind, until the day you stepped to my door. He drew a breath, eyes fixed on the dark window. They look at me and call me a rough man, too hard for anyone to live with. Truth is, I'm just someone left behind. Same as you. Amara held her breath. Heat swelled in her chest. For years she had thought no one could understand, that her pain was hers alone. Yet here sat a man bearing the same wound. Life had taken from him what he could never replace. She lifted a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Caleb caught it, turned her palm over, and pressed his lips to it. A kiss, plain and deep, a vow without words. Amara shivered. In 10 years of scorn, no one had touched her hand with reverence. Even her husband had gripped it only for show. Now warmth from Caleb's lips seemed to wash away all the old scars. Tears fell, but they tasted of release, not shame. "We," Amara whispered, "we are both the ones left behind." Caleb nodded slightly. "That is why I see you, and you see me." Nothing left to prove to the world, they sat long together, words no longer needed. The fire dwindled, but another flame rose, one of understanding, of two battered souls finding anchor in each other. That night, when Amara rested her head against his shoulder, she no longer felt like an outcast. And he, for the first time in 8 years, felt the cabin was not just shelter, but home. Spring came with the rush of the stream and the scent of wildflowers filling the valley. Amara sat on the porch with a sack of seeds Caleb had brought from town. She opened each packet, sowing into the freshly turned soil. Cool earth closed over the tiny seeds, as though guarding her fragile hopes. Each morning she lingered in the yard, watching hens chase their chicks like small pupils. She broke bits of grain, teaching them to peck. Sometimes a chick clambered onto her dress, leaving brown stains, but she only laughed and soothed them as though they were children. Inside, she set the cabin in order, washed curtains, mended cloths, placed jars of wildflowers on the table. Small changes made the place breathe. When Caleb stepped through the door, he noticed it each time. The smell of bread, the herbs drying above the hearth, the clean scent of sun-warmed fabric. He watched her in silence. The timidity she once carried had eased, replaced by quiet peace. He saw the cabin remade not just by her hands, but by the light she carried within. The thought stirred in him something he had never dared. Perhaps it was time to think beyond winters and harvests, time to imagine a future. One afternoon, after a soft rain, they worked together to mend the henhouse, blown askew by the wind. Amara insisted on helping, though Caleb warned against the heavy work. She laughed, said her hands could labor too, and he relented, standing close in case. She stretched to lift a beam into place, her boots slipping in the wet earth. Caleb caught her by the shoulders, pulling her against his chest. The world stilled. Amara looked up, her blue eyes locking on his. Their breaths mingled, the space between them no wider than a heartbeat. Caleb's hand tightened, as though afraid if he let go she would vanish. Amara felt the warmth through her dress, heat flooding her skin, her heart thudding wild. Her cheeks flushed, yet she did not look away. She held his gaze as though speaking what her lips could not. At last, Caleb cleared his throat, stepped back, leaving safe distance. But both knew something had shifted. That evening they sat on the porch, the valley awash in gold. Amara rested her hands on her knees, still feeling the weight of his touch. Caleb said nothing, but his eyes lingered on her, as though unwilling to lose the fragile moment. In her chest, a quiet fire glowed, not fierce but steady, warm enough to heal old wounds, and in Caleb's silence, hope rose new, hope for a true home, with the woman he had chosen long before he dared admit it. Night settled over the winterland in deep silence. Snow fell heavy across the porch, blanketing the cabin roof and the narrow path that wound into the pines. Supper had just been cleared. The scent of stew and fresh bread still lingered in the air. Amara carried dishes to the basin, while Caleb laid another log on the fire, its glow flickering across his weathered face. The room was warm, yet his heart pounded as though he stood outside in the cold. For weeks he had held back the words pressing against his chest. Each time he looked into Amara's eyes, fear of wounding her sealed his lips. But tonight, watching her turn at the wash basin, the hem of her dress stirring in the firelight, he knew he could wait no longer. He stepped forward, boots sounding light against the floor. Amara looked up, startled to find him close, his hands clenched, his gaze burning. "Amara," he said, voice low and rough, "there's something I must say." She dried her hands and faced him. In her eyes flickered worry, as though bracing for another denial from life itself. Caleb drew breath, his hand trembling, then spoke slow and sure. "Not out of pity. Not out of duty. I want you to know I choose you, because you are the only one I wish to walk beside, to the end of the trail." The air froze still. Amara stood motionless, her hands clasped tight. His words cut through the armor she had worn for years. 10 years she had heard only rejection, only scorn that called her useless. And now, here was a man daring to stand before her and say he chose her. "You?" Her voice cracked, breaking into sobs. Tears streamed down her cheeks, falling on her trembling hands. "After all these years, at last someone sees me." Caleb did not hesitate. He took her hands, lifted them, and pressed his lips to each finger. The warmth of his kiss made her tremble, but not with fear, with trust. "Amara," he said, his voice firm as an oath, "be my wife." She wept, but through her tears came a radiant smile. Words could not carry the flood inside her. The shame, the lonely nights, the weight of being cast aside, gone in an instant. She nodded until her neck ached. "Yes, I will." Caleb drew her into his arms. They held each other fast, like two wanderers who had at last found their resting place. He bent, kissed her mouth. The kiss was not rushed, not wild, but deep, full of promise. Their lips touched, trembling, like a new beginning carved into both hearts. Outside, the snow still fell. They opened the door and stepped onto the porch, letting the white flakes drift into their hair, their shoulders. The night sky hung dark, yet the countless flakes shimmered with faint light, turning the world to something almost holy. Amara looked up at Caleb, tears still glistening. He brushed the last drops from her lashes, whispering, "From this day, you are never alone." In the hush of wind and falling snow, they kissed again, longer, deeper, sealing the truth that every old wound had closed, leaving room only for this new beginning. And there, beneath the endless snowfall, a woman once cast out by a whole town became, at last, the one chosen. Winter gave way to thin bands of sunlight slipping through the pines, carrying the smell of damp earth and the sound of a stream rushing alive again. Amara began to notice small, strange changes in her body. Mornings came with weariness. Her head swam when she sat too long at her sewing. The taste of food shifted. Stew she once relished, now hard to swallow, while her mouth watered for the sharp bite of a sour apple. At first, she thought it was the long winter draining her strength. But when her hand drifted to her lower belly, she felt a faint, unfamiliar tightness, something both foreign and known. She sat still a long while, her heartbeat loud in her ears, as though her body held a secret it feared to speak aloud. She did not tell Caleb right away. Fear of false hope, after 10 years of disappointment, pressed her into silence. Yet the signs grew clearer. The morning sickness, the sudden sharpness to the scent of wood smoke, and most of all, the warmth she felt beneath her palm when she touched her belly. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Caleb reading, Amara sewing, her hand faltered. The needle stilled, her breath quickened. She looked at the fire's glow, then at the man beside her, and let the words slip out in a trembling whisper. Caleb, I think I'm carrying a life within me. The book fell from his hands. His dark eyes lit, his whole body stilled. He turned, caught her hand in his grip shaking so hard she could hear the pound of his heart. He said nothing, only sank to his knees, pressing his face against her belly, as though to hear the breath of a soul not yet born. Merciful God, his voice cracked, hoarse. This is a miracle. Amara broke into tears. For years she had borne the name barren, condemned by her husband and by a town. Now her body itself gave the answer. She had never been the broken one. The news did not stay hidden long. When she went to town for cloth and thread, her cheeks flush with health, the faint swell of her belly showing. The whispers spread faster than the spring wind. It can't be. She truly is with child? 10 years they cursed her, and wrongly all along. So Thomas Vaughan was the barren one. The day she walked the street with Caleb at her side, the eyes on her were no longer scornful, but ashamed. Those who had laughed lowered their heads. Those who had condemned would not meet her gaze. Her former husband, Thomas Vaughan, stood rigid on the saloon steps. His eyes dropped to her belly, then flinched away as though struck by steel. Around him came the bitter hiss of voices. Coward, blaming her all those years. He's the useless one, too proud to admit it. Thomas bowed his head and turned away, but the curses followed him down the street. Amara walked on, her hand resting over her belly, her heart trembling with pride and fear all at once. Caleb leaned near, whispering, "Let them bear their shame. You owe them nothing," Wetzel looked at him, her eyes wet. After years of being branded worthless, she now stood in the street, with life growing inside her, proof beyond any word. No defense needed, no plea required. A single heartbeat within was answer enough. That night, back at the cabin, Amara sat by the fire, her hand still resting on her belly. Caleb stood behind her, his arms closing around her, his warmth covering them both. "You were chosen," he whispered, "and so is our child. Chosen to be born in love, not in disgrace." Amara leaned her head against his chest and let the tears fall, but this time they tasted sweet, like freedom at last. That spring, the valley stirred with life. Ice melted into clear streams, sunlight flashing across the water like silver. Amara, her belly rounding more each day, walked slowly through the small garden behind the cabin. In her hands she carried a sack of seeds Caleb had brought from town. She knelt, dirt clinging to her fingers, sowing each tiny seed into the freshly turned earth. Never in her life had such simple work brought her such joy. A seed in the ground, a promise of new life. She smiled faintly, teaching the timid chicks darting at her feet to scatter and peck. Their soft cries mingled with the stream's song, turning the yard into a scene of peace. Inside, the cabin bore her touch everywhere. New curtains she had sewn lifted at the window. She had set flowers in jars upon the table, folded embroidered cloths onto shelves. The house that once served only as shelter had grown into something more, a home. Caleb noticed it all. From the porch, he watched Amara bent to her work in the garden, her cheeks bright, her eyes no longer shadowed as they had been the day she first arrived. The change struck him silent. He had never thought to find such warmth again, never dared to picture a cabin filled with laughter. Yet here it stood before him, as though fate itself had placed it in his path. One afternoon, they worked together to mend the henhouse, sagging from winter storms. Amara insisted on helping, though Caleb told her to rest. She stood on tiptoe to set a beam in place, her boots slipping on damp earth. She swayed. In a heartbeat, Caleb caught her shoulders, pulling her against his chest, her breath tangled with his, their faces close enough to share one. Amara's eyes widened, her blue gaze locking into his. In the amber light, his dark eyes seemed deep as a mountain lake. Neither moved. His hand pressed gently at her shoulder, speaking more than words. At last she smiled, stepped back, but her gaze lingered in his, a thread invisible yet binding. Time moved on, her belly swelling. In the evenings, she sat on the porch, knitting small garments for the child, while Caleb mended an old saddle at her side. Words were few, but the silence between them no longer felt empty. The day the town stopped whispering, stopped looking at her with scorn, was the day Amara felt peace settle over her heart. Faces had changed, but they no longer mattered. What mattered was that when she turned, Caleb was always there, with the cabin, and with the life stirring within her. One evening at sunset, as the wind carried the scent of wild grass, the three of them, Amara, Caleb, and the child yet to be born, sat together on the porch. Amara rested her head against his shoulder, her hand upon her belly. Caleb wrapped his arm around them both. Before them lay the valley, green fields rolling out, mountains fading into the gold of day's end. No crowd watched, no cheers sounded. Only them, two once cast aside, now sheltered by life itself. Amara whispered, her eyes on the horizon. I never thought I could be this happy. Caleb pressed a kiss into her hair, his voice low. Because we found each other. That is the true miracle. And in that moment, the little cabin among the pines no longer stood alone. It had become a home, where a family began, and where the final miracle was written, not in pity but in love and in faith. One summer night, the fields around the cabin bloomed with wildflowers. The sky washed in the soft glow of a new moon. But inside, the air was tight with strain, each breath heavy. Amara lay in bed, sweat darkening her hair, her hand clutching the sheet as waves of pain racked her body. Caleb sat close, his broad hands clumsy and trembling. He wiped the sweat from her brow, whispering as though in prayer, You can do this, Amara. I'm here. Right here outside. The wind rustled. The stream murmured like a heartbeat urging her on. Inside, the lamplight cast Caleb's weathered face in sharp relief, showing a fear he had never known. He had faced wild beasts and winters that tried to kill him, but nothing had ever shaken him like this. The moment the woman he loved fought to bring a life into the world. Amara cried out, her whole body straining. Caleb gripped her hand, feeling her bones press hard against his palm. Then, at last, a cry, weak and small, split the silence of the night. Both Amara and Caleb wept with it. He took the swaddled bundle from the old midwife he had brought from town. In his arms lay a red, wrinkled child, tiny hands flailing into the air. Its cry filled the cabin, the sound of life itself. Caleb looked down, eyes wet, a strange light breaking across his face like sun after storm. He lifted his gaze to Amara, exhausted, yet smiling faintly, then back to the child. His voice shook. You are the greatest gift we could ever be given." He bent and kissed the child's brow. In that instant, the man once called the loner of the mountains became a father. At dawn, sunlight spilled through the window. Birds sang in the garden. Chicks darted across the yard. Amara sat propped against the headboard, the baby sleeping against her chest. Caleb sat beside her, eyes never leaving them. He could hardly believe this cabin, once empty, now brimmed with life. He reached to clasp her hand, squeezing gently in a vow without words. Amara met his gaze, her blue eyes shining. She whispered, "We truly have a family now, Caleb." Curtains swayed in the breeze, wildflower scent drifting in. Peace lay so deep, it seemed the world beyond had ceased to matter. That evening, they sat on the porch. Caleb cradled the child in his arms, pride blazing in his eyes, as though he wished the mountains to witness it. Amara leaned against him, her hand clasping both his and the baby's. Far off, the peaks rose like sentinels, the sky fading gold with the setting sun. There, the three of them sat together, a woman once cast aside, a man once broken by loss, and the child who was their final miracle. No town's judgment, no praise was needed. They had found their shelter in each other, found the true meaning of home. And so, in a cabin deep in the quiet woods, a family began, simple, enduring, built on love stronger than stone and a bond longer than the river's course. That evening, as the sun sank and shadows spread across the valley, Amara sat on the porch. Beside her was Caleb, the man who had entered her life in silence and become her heart's foundation. In their arms lay a newborn life, the proof of a new beginning, a true home. The chirp of chicks, the scent of fresh bread, the stream's steady song, all blended into the music of an ordinary day. But within that simplicity lay the miracle. From a woman once shamed, from a man once alone, came trust, love, and the building of a family. This story holds no grand victories, no glittering promises, only long-held glances, hands brushing while mending a henhouse, evenings by the fire where silence spoke enough. Yet in these small things lived a strength, the strength of being seen, chosen, and loved without condition. For many, old age may bring regrets of what was lost. But the tale of Amara and Caleb reminds us, at any mile along the trail, love can come, hope can rise again, and a home can be built from two trembling, honest hands. To you, dear friends, thank you for walking this journey. If the story has touched your heart, share your thoughts in a comment about Amara, about Caleb, or about your own memories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next tale. And to those in the twilight years, I send this wish. May you always find peace, love, and the small daily miracles of life. Sometimes all it takes is a porch, someone beside you, and a gentle look. That is enough to steady the heart.